Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you doing?
I'm good, Nick, and yourself?
I'm pretty good, thanks. And Dr. John Endres. John, how are you doing?
How's it, Nick? All good. Glad for the relief that the rain brings.
Indeed, it is
Yes.
very, very welcome, except in the bits where it floods. But so far, my house remains unflooded. So, what are we going to talk about today? Well, let's start off with it must be one of President Ramaphosa's greatest quotes of all time. The president has been speaking to the mining indaba in Cape Town on Tuesday, which it looks like government pulled out all the stops, sent a large delegation to the mining indaba, was on the floor talking to all the big mining companies and big business. In Ramaphosa's comments to the mining indaba, he criticized private business for not helping government enough to solve some of the problems. He said, quote, "We're not saying you should not be critical, but we are saying stop moaning. We say to Labour, stop moaning as well. Get into the ring with us. Let us find solutions for the common good of our country." He acknowledged the many crises facing the country in the mining sector. And he said, "We are determined to remove all impediments and create an environment that will drive sustained growth in mining. Sometimes government prefers to do things on their own. But faced with this type of crisis, we have seen that it is the best to work with those who have common interests with us." He then went on to elaborate on what he said were efforts by, for example, the police to crack down on illegal mining, and that there were reforms being driven to speed up electricity generation. John, what do you make of the comment that big business must stop moaning and get into the ring and help government out here?
This really is the most amusing, I think, as you've appropriately put it. An acquaintance of mine said that the president's speech had been most excellent if the ANC had been elected into office 6 weeks ago. But of course, they have been around for almost 3 decades, and that makes the entire speech sound a little bit tired and a little bit weary. And we know we've been here before, we've heard it all before. Government sort of, shifting blame elsewhere. In this case, it's singling out Labour and big business and saying those guys have to come to the party, then everything's going to work out. And it's not terribly impressive, but I think reflective of the state of the party that has not been performing very well. The chickens are coming home to roost. We are saddled with really bad problems right now in terms of load shedding, water infrastructure, transport infrastructure, law enforcement across the board. The outcomes are bad. And I think it is not because of big business moaning or Labour moaning, but it really is because of the policy failures of the ANC itself. So it would do the president, I think, well to accept the blame and accept responsibility for these failures rather than trying to find external parties that he can shift it to. Nick?
It's just so incredible to me. I don't know how many people know about how, for example, ANC MPs speak on the committees about businesses. They describe big business often as the enemy, as there being such a thing as a capital strike, as an attempt to sabotage the government. There's this constant sort of drumbeat of these mining companies are the enemy and they must be shackled and forced to work for us, and they're stealing our minerals and sending them overseas when they should be refining them here. And then the gall to turn around when your party just constantly says things like this and follows through policies that are like this, and then says, "Oh yeah, but you're not helping us and it's really your fault." Terence, your thoughts?
Well, this is a family show, so I probably can't really express my thoughts. Okay. This is, when he says, we need to work with partners and we're busy removing all these obstacles. All right, this doesn't go back to the Zuma era or back to the Mbeki era. It goes back to the P.W. Botha era. We were going to make South Africa an attractive environment to do business in. This is a refrain we've been hearing for 40 years. It's a sort of dread continuity between the old and new regimes. So, been there, done that, got many T-shirts. Business must come on board and help. Labor mustn't complain. It's I think here's the problem. In an ideal world, yes, that I think a cooperative relationship between business and labor, or between a business and government is a good thing. You can have too much of it, in which case you start getting collusion, which is bad. But I think the problem in South Africa for both labor and business is that government is not a credible partner. As I say, we've been talking about an appropriate regulatory environment since the 1980s. Ramaphosa was saying the other day, well, we must remain undeterred in our fight against crime and corruption. Well, I remember it wasn't that long ago that any talk about crime was just code for racism. Now we realize actually we do have a crime problem, but we have a state that is just not capable of doing anything about it, even if it wanted to. And I don't always think it does, because many insiders are deeply invested in the pathologies as they exist. So this is good boilerplate stuff, but it's rather like you're living in some sort of fantasy world. It's rather like a generation of labor policy that sort of assumes we have a workforce educated to Scandinavian standards, where, as we're going to talk about later, we have a workforce that frequently struggles with basic literacy and numeracy. No, it's kind of like you couldn't take a computer back 100 years and operate it, because you don't have the technology to understand it, you don't have the technology to manufacture the technology in a few steps. It's almost like we can't deal with our problems because we don't even identify those problems properly. At least the government doesn't. The rest of us do. Maybe that's a starting point. Maybe try and understand what the problems are and just ask those people that you want to help you, rather than bazooking their heads off when they speak up.
So what's also interesting is that the Mining Council of South Africa, through a spokesperson, said that, quote, President Ramaphosa's speech hit all the right notes, and he has touched on key points that are constraining the mining industry, but it is absolutely vital that we see real urgency on implementing the interventions and measures he outlined. We need action. The time for talking has long passed. That was from Roger Baxter, who's the CEO. John, it strikes me firstly like this is sort of sycophantic when you've just been kind of blamed for not helping things to come out of the Mining Council. But also, I think it speaks to what's really the issue here in many ways, which is that it's not really clear, so the president in his speech talked about, we're streamlining this process and doing that. But it's not often clear that despite what government claims it's going to do in speeches, it actually implements at all on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a sort of a question in my mind over whether there can ever be a level of pressure sufficient to create a sense of urgency that translates into actual action. And we have seen the pressure mounting, right? Where we're seeing the ANC dropping in the polls, dropping in the elections. We saw the way the ANC caucus called the Eskom management in to complain about load shedding and saying, guys, we're going to lose the elections if load shedding continues. You've got to do something about this. So we can see the urgency creeping in. But what we're not yet seeing, I think, is a translation of that urgency into making really tough decisions. And so when we look at the Operation Vulindlela reforms, they're all quite nice, sort of tinkering around the edges and reducing a bit of red tape and making visa applications easier, which is useful, but it doesn't change the big picture in South Africa. And the big picture is really centered around things like race-based policy, like cadre deployment, like threats to property rights, the basics that we keep talking about on this show. And those are the things that never get mentioned. And I think until that happens, all of this talk is just talk, and it's not going to translate into action. And as you rightly said, so many announcements get made, so few of them get delivered on. And one very interesting example of that is infrastructure announcements, which going back a decade, I can remember President Zuma at the time, in his SONA speeches, every single year announcing huge infrastructure projects and billions of rands going into water and electricity and sanitation. But it never, ever happened. That we can see it in the gross fixed capital formation rate, an indicator that measures how much investment is going into the economy. And that's just going down all the way. It's both the government and also the private sector that aren't investing. In the case of the private sector, I think because they don't trust their investments to be safe, so they're withholding. They don't think that they can make a return on them. They think they're going to lose their investments. And the government, who knows why? Because they talk about it. They seem to recognize the importance of infrastructure, but the spending doesn't happen. And when it does happen, of course, the problem is that very often the money is badly spent or misappropriated or gets wasted. So, we're not getting bang for buck, and the government is still treading water despite the mounting pressure that we're seeing on it. Nick?
So I think that's a great segue.
Is there any example in South Africa that you can think of where a major infrastructure project has been delivered on time and on budget? Because I can't.
No. Yeah, no, not to my mind. You probably have to go back until the time before I was an adult to find one.
World Cup stadiums,
didn't they run over time a bit
grades.
though? I seem to remember they were.
Well, they got them done in time.
Yeah, they weren't outrageous though. By the standards of today, I wonder if we could have managed them. Anyway, this is all a great segue to our second topic, which is that unbundling Eskom is taking too long, says the outgoing CEO, Andre de Ruyter. De Ruyter has said that he thinks that some of the reforms coming from government now with regards to the electricity generation are really good, but he thinks that the licenses and legislative changes are too low. He says that at Eskom, we have done everything we can. We concluded an asset transfer agreement. We set up a national transmission company of South Africa. We have set up separate balance sheets, income statements. We've separated the software. That is no minor exercise with regards to creating a transmission company. The unbundling of Eskom into three separate units, transmission, generation, and distribution, was announced in 2019. And yet, apparently, according to De Ruyter, Eskom is still sitting around waiting for licenses. Legislative changes need to be made by Parliament. And it all just seems to be kind of frozen in the bureaucracy of the state. And once again, we come back to exactly the same question that we were talking about a second ago, which is that here, government has unambiguously committed to this policy of we're going to split Eskom into three. Promises it, and then it just gets stuck, and nothing happens. John, why?
Well, we'll get to the why now, but maybe just to point out how important this is. The purpose of this exercise is to enable private power producers to ship their power out to consumers over the grid. And for as long as the grid is part of Eskom, you as a private power producer don't know if you're going to get good service or under what terms you even can deliver power to customers. So imagine, you're thinking of building a solar farm in the Northern Cape, and you say, well, okay, I want to make this investment. Then I want to sell the electricity on. It has to go to Gauteng or to the Western Cape. But I don't actually know who I'm selling it to. I'll have to sell it to Eskom at the moment. And Eskom is competing with me as a generator. So it's quite possible that, I'm going to be schneid on this deal. And so I'm not going to invest in private power generation. So you need a separate entity. It has to be properly separate with its own board, as De Ruyter has said, its own systems, its own oversight, et cetera, so that if you have your plant in the Northern Cape, you can sell to that transmission company knowing that you are going to be treated on an equal footing as all other generating units, including Eskom itself. And that is exactly what hasn't happened so far. And it's puzzling but not surprising that this is the case, because again, we talk about this pressure to change. We're at crazy levels of load shedding. We can see the economy taking huge strain as a result. And it should be obvious that this is one of the things you've got to do now and move on really fast. Eskom, I think, has delivered from its side. According to De Ruyter, they've done what they could. But now they have to wait for the government to issue licenses and finalize the process so this company can actually start operating. And that hasn't happened. Is this because of, is this intentional or is it unintentional? We don't know. Maybe it's a mix of the two. Maybe it is that there are certain segments of the government that do want to process this and that want to get it done, that they recognize the urgency. But there are other parts of the government that sabotage, that slow it down, delay it, or simply don't care enough to make it happen. But the end result is the same, which is that we're stuck with the existing situation and no progress. Nick?
So I think a contributing factor here, and this is part of my grand half-baked theory, is that the civil service has, due to sort of cater deployments, toleration of incompetence, that kind of stuff, been infused with a very strong culture of inertia, which is going to take major civil service reform to undo. And I think back to my brief time in local government when I was on the Public Safety Committee for Johannesburg. And every meeting was the same, literally sometimes down to the reports, which occasionally would be copied and pasted, as in someone would copy and paste last month's report and then just go and change some of the dates, but they'd often forget a date or two here, and you'd realize that you were reading last month's numbers. People would come through and say, the traffic fine management system isn't working, and we've tried to get this from some department, but then they haven't answered us, so we're just sitting around waiting for it to happen. And everything was just frozen in time, and it didn't matter what policy. And this was, of course, this was a coalition government, not even an ANC government. Every time anyone proposed anything, it would sort of be announced, and then everyone would just keep doing what they had always done. It was kind of the dinosaur method of running a system, which is everyone just plods on as though nothing has changed. Terence, do you think that there's any validity to this idea? And could this explain some of what's going on?
Look, not only do I think that there's validity, I think you probably explained it very well. Look, I think that there's enough corruption to gnaw through the hull of a World War II battleship. But I think that basically there is a sort of, as you say, a culture of mediocrity, but also a culture of fear. No one really wants to take responsibility for anything because you don't want to get a target on your back. I've heard this again and again from people in the civil servants and politicians who have insights here, that it's a very, very rule-bound system. We often fail to realize this, and that is a huge disincentive to doing anything, because you can almost certainly be found. Your actions, no matter how well intentioned or whatever, can almost certainly be found wanting. And if somebody wants to put a target on your back, well, they will. In fact, one civil servant I know who actually works in the Western Cape administration, and I would say politically would be kind of more on the DA side, said this is something. Said that one has to be careful about criticizing unions too aggressively, because if you are on the wrong side of a vengeful manager, and this is, he says, is a problem throughout the civil service. Doesn't matter who you are, what your politics are. You're very, very grateful to have those protections and to have people who can step in and fight your corner. But yeah, I think that we've taken a system that required a particular degree of professionalism and and skill and nuance to operate, but it hasn't been capacitated, so it's become a sort of perfect ecosystem for vendettas and patronage and just about everything that it was designed to keep out. These rules and regulations are double-edged swords.
So I think the solution to all of this is, and it's the line suggested by our colleague Corrigan, is you kind of actually just need to get in from on the top level and at the middle level, managers who will follow procedures correctly and hold people to account and just fire those who need to be fired. No one gets fired in the civil service, pretty much, unless you fall afoul of some political faction. Basically, people just get sort of endlessly shuffled around. And it just seems like you could actually undo a lot of damage if you just, to use a colloquial phrase, put some stick about. John, any final? Go ahead, Terence.
Look, I think something else is that the frustration of working in that environment means that people who are driven, who are ambitious or whatever, will go somewhere else.
100%.
People who do want to make things happen, who just find themselves sort of sitting in the same desk year after year in a toxic environment. Why put yourself through this?
John, final thoughts?
Yeah, final thought is that there are exceptions. And I experienced an exception a few weeks ago when I went to renew my driver's license at the Waterfall Center here in Johannesburg. And that was the most amazing experience. Because there, you had civil servants not only doing their job, but operating at a high pace with high accuracy, high professionalism, and high friendliness. And I think it does us well to just remember that from time to time. As bad as 99% of the civil service is, you do get exceptions, and it's wonderful to see. It's such a relief to realize that it doesn't have to be the way that it is in almost all areas of life in South Africa, but that you can get it right. But otherwise, I completely agree with you guys. Much of the problem in South African governance, I think, is that the machinery is broken. The machine for taking inputs in the form of tax and purchases, translating that into outputs is not functioning. And to fix that machine is going to take probably a sledgehammer and a big wrench. With a small screwdriver won't do it. So yeah, it has to come from the top, and it has to be a really serious effort. And then it can be made to work, as Waterfall shows, for example. Nick.
Right. And this is exactly why the ANC is, I think, having such a good time, because even as they face down the barrel of possible electoral calamity, it's very scary to them, I think, that they just can't seem to be able to do it, and they definitely aren't willing to take that sledgehammer approach. But anyway, let's move on to our next story. We often talk on the show about the extreme problems with South African education. We usually talk about it with regards to matric and that kind of end of the education process. But in a recent study done by a researcher at Stellenbosch University, it's revealed that reading skills amongst kids who are kind of quite new to the education system in the first few years are really, really bad. According to this research, 50% of children in no-fee schools, so that's essentially schools where no one pays any fees to be there, unlike the former Model C schools or private schools where parents often chip in to the school's budget. 50% of children in no-fee schools do not learn the letters of the alphabet by the end of grade 1, and there is no national reading plan and no budget for reading. It also looks like, according to some of this research, that the percentage of grade 4 pupils who cannot read for meaning, so in other words, the kids, they might be able to sound out the words in a paragraph, but they don't actually understand what they're reading, has risen from 78% in 2016 who cannot read for meaning to 82% in 2021. And I would not be surprised if that number is either the same or slightly worse now. Terence? This is kind of what you were talking about. Only 18% of kids in grade 4 can actually read for meaning. How can you build any kind of skilled, healthy workforce if you literally aren't producing literate kids?
You can't. That's the basic idea. Look, this is a complicated issue. Channel my inner Jordan Peterson. This is a complicated issue, man. In partial defense of the current government, they inherited a massive problem. But we often, I think, misdiagnose that our problem isn't so much about resources. It's not what we spend on it. It's how we spend it, and the way that is, and the sort of return we get for that investment. We spend quite respectably by global standards as a proportion of GDP. But teaching, I think, in South Africa was often seen as a low status position. If you were in a nice white government school, generally speaking, it was women whose husbands had were the primary breadwinners, and they could devote a lot of time and effort and care to their charges. Amongst Black people, it is one of the very few white collar careers that was widely available to Black people. For that reason, you got a lot of entrants to the profession who temperamentally were not suited to it. In addition, you have a linguistic problem, that you have children being instructed in a language that is not their home language by teachers for whom that is also not their home language. I mean, this is just a what's the phrase? Pedagogical nightmare. But it has not been helped by the deference to the ANC aligned trade unions. To SADTU, and there's a particular reason for that. The blue collar unions, the mine workers and metal workers and whatever, that's been a declining share of the workforce and of the unionized workforce. It's those white collar unions that become very, very influential around election time. And there is an enormous reluctance to antagonize them. So yeah, I remember a couple of years ago there was a report into the purchasing of administrative posts in the education system. Now, the world over, this is regarded as absolutely crucial for an effective education system, having headmasters and school administrators who know what they're doing and can actually sort of whip teachers into line, use their time correctly, make sure they have the materials they need. Now, when this is being distributed as a source of patronage, you're not hiding to nothing. You wonder why a country like Vietnam, poorer than South Africa, that in the 1980s had sort of 6-digit inflation or whatever it was, that was at a bare subsistence level, and had just come out of 3 devastating wars. It was the Vietnam War against the Americans and the French and whatever. Then it was against the Cambodians, then against the Chinese. Bang, bang, bang. Now has students, and it's still a poor country, but that perform at the top of world rankings in maths and science. They're doing something that we aren't. Now, it's not quite clear exactly what that is, but they don't seem to be messing around with their education. Now, from personal experience of having lived in that part of the world, or a little bit away, those Asian countries really invest a lot in education and also a lot of social capital. It's a very respected profession. Chinese, there is actually a title, teacher, lao si, which is given to somebody who does that job. We have used it as a source of kind of patronage and sheltered employment, and the results are, at least to some extent, what we're seeing.
John, how do we get out of this mess?
Well, firstly, I think the reason it is so infuriating is because you can fairly describe it as a betrayal. This is a betrayal of children. I've got children of my own. And I think every parent or any parent who sees these numbers and thinks of their own child being exposed to this level of deprivation of opportunity for a lifetime must be very angry about it. That is a level of anger we're not seeing in the ANC or in the authorities at all. They seem to be quite relaxed over the current state of affairs. And that is just completely unacceptable. How do we get out of it? Our proposal from the IRR is school vouchers. You need to give parents the choice of where to send their children and equip them with money to pay the schools to educate their children and let them choose the best schools. This is an approach that hasn't worked everywhere in the world under all conditions. But we think in South Africa, given the scale of the challenge that we face now, the problem that we've got, this approach is probably the best that you can do. You need to empower parents to make that school choice. Stay away from the bad schools, head in droves towards the good schools, and lift the entire education system by doing this. That is probably the only way. Maybe as a closing comment, we've got an education report coming out in the next few weeks, I guess. So keep an eye on the IR website and on our channels. It'll give you lots of facts, stats, and data around the current state of education, as well as what can be done to fix it. Nick?
No, definitely, we will punt that on the show the moment it's out. And I think that's all that we have time for today. So thank you very much for listening, and we hope that you found it interesting. We'll be back tomorrow on the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone.